timing. All right, so this is the story of the three little elves. So there are three little elves, and they are in the MariKaNa village. This is a small village by the water, and there's dragons there, and there's fairies, and each of the elves has a fairy godmother, because the way that their community works is that everybody has a godparent from a different community, so that each of the children, as they grow up, have the opportunity to learn about the different communities. So you have the first little elf. She is getting ready to go to high school, and so she is learning about the elf business and what her parents did to do in the community to support the community. And so you have the next little elf. She is in middle school, and so she is being exposed as a middle school elf to all of the different jobs in the community, in the village. So because with the middle school elves, they allow them to learn all the different jobs in the hopes that they will decide that the jobs that their parents did are the jobs that they want. They don't want them to feel like they're losing anything by not doing someone else's job. And then you have the little elf who is in about 5th or 6th grade, and this little elf is learning that what it means to be an elf. And so she has like powers that are turning on. She can do things she couldn't do when she was smaller, and she's really learning about those different powers that she has. So each of these little elves, they have a fairy godmother. So because they're elves, they have a godparent who's of a different background than them. So they all have fairy godparents. And so, and each of the elves has a different fairy godparent. And these fairies are all, they're friends, of course. And they are the type of fairy godparents who don't really try to give yes or no answers. So you know how sometimes you have grandparents who you could ask them a question and they kind of turn it into a question and give it back to you. That's what these fairy godparents are. Instead of telling the girls yes or no, they sort of ask them the question in a different way. They reflect the question back to them to see if they can come to a decision for themselves, because the fairies know more than anyone else, being that they ride on the air, is that wherever the wind blows, there is an answer. But it is up to you, the person who is setting the sail, to decide which wind you would like to use when you're setting your sail. You have to know which wind to use. So if you're on a river or something and you're trying to go to the other side of the river, you don't want to use a south wind, you want to use a north wind. You have to know the wind, because messages come through the wind. And the fairies are very aware of that, but the elves, they don't quite know that the messages come through the wind. And so the fairies are trying to make sure that the little elves are capable of hearing the messages in the wind, but not necessarily listening to every message that comes in the wind, because there's some very, very mean and wicked what would you call them? Like wizards. There's some wicked wizards that they send messages into the wind. That's all they do, all day and all night. They put messages in the wind, and many an elf are distracted by the messages that the wizards put in the wind. And the wizards use all kinds of magic to send these messages in the wind. And so an unsuspecting fairy or an unsuspecting elf who has not had the training by a fairy godmother may think that every message they hear in the wind is for them. So the fairy godparents take it very seriously to teach the elves how to determine which wind is the best for them to follow, which wind gives them the truest answer. Because the fairies know that the real answers come from the inside. They don't come from the outside. But the elves don't know this. They're very young. They're still learning. So the oldest elf goes to her fairy godmother and she asks her, should I do the job of my parents? Should I take on the family business? And the fairy godmother asks her, if you didn't take on the job of the elf family business, if you didn't take on the job of the elf family business, what would you do? And the elf was very confused at this, because even though she had been through the training that the middle school elves get, and she didn't like any of those jobs particularly, she had done no exploring of the village since the time when in the middle school they had taken them to all these places to see all the jobs. She'd done no exploring of her on her own. She didn't ask any further questions. She wasn't curious about different people's jobs, and she hadn't talked to anyone. And so she couldn't answer that question. And so the fairy godmother told her, well, when you have an answer to that question, come back and we'll talk about it. So the middle school elf went to her fairy godmother, and she asked her, am I only allowed to have one of these jobs in the village? And the fairy godmother asked the middle school elf, well, what jobs would you like to do? And the middle school elf thought about that, and she said, well, I like the elf family business. It's a good business. But I also like the fairy family business. I love to help people and give them questions to answer and to help them think. And the elf family business is very much working with your hands and, getting dirty. And I love that too. But I also like to talk to people. And her fairy godmother said to her, well, my child, nobody said you had to choose one. In this village, you can have as many jobs as you want. And the middle school elf was very excited about that. She really remembered that as she was looking at all these different jobs, because she thought to herself, man, I love all of this stuff. Maybe I'll get a bunch of different jobs. I'll do many different things because all of these things look so exciting and interesting. The elementary school elf, she asked her fairy godmother, must I use these elf powers? Because the elf powers are very, very different from the fairy powers. And I would much prefer to have the fairy powers than the elf powers. And her fairy godmother looked very confused. And she said to her, well, elves have elf power and fairies have fairy power. I do not know that you can have the power of the fairy if you're an elf. And the child asked her fairy godmother further, well, if I can't have the power of the fairy, does that mean I can only do the job of the elf? And the fairy godmother pondered that, said to her, well, the job of the elf and the job of the fairy is not contingent on the power that they have. These are choices. You can choose to use the power of the fairies. You can choose to use the power of the elf. But it does not mean you become an elf or become a fairy if you're an elf, or become an elf if you're a fairy. You're just using those powers. Because all the powers are within you. Just depends on which ones you use. And the elementary school fairy was very, very satisfied with that answer. And she thought that she was going to use the powers of the elf